The thunder crashed across the Montana sky as Delilah Ward clutched her drenched shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders, wondering how her life had spiraled so dramatically from Boston society to crawling beneath a stranger's porch in the middle of nowhere. The rain pounded relentlessly, turning the dirt road into a river of mud that threatened to sweep away what little remained of her former life, a single carpetbag containing her mother's silver hairbrush, 2 dresses, and the last letter from her father before pneumonia took him 3 months ago. Delilah pressed herself deeper into the shadows beneath the weathered porch boards as lightning illuminated the landscape. She'd been traveling west for nearly a month, her teaching position in Promise Creek seemingly the answer to her prayers after her family's creditors had seized their Boston home. But the stagecoach had dropped her miles from her destination when a wheel axle broke, the driver pointing vaguely westward before continuing south with the other passengers. "You'll find Promise Creek that way, miss. Only about 5 miles. Someone'll likely come along." No one had come along. The gathering storm had driven her toward the only shelter visible on the horizon, this solitary ranch house standing proud against the darkening sky. Pride had kept her from knocking on the door. She was a Ward, after all, not some beggar. She'd wait out the rain and continue her journey. The sound of boots on the porch above startled her. Heavy, deliberate steps moved across the wooden planks, pausing at the edge. Delilah held her breath. "Madam," a deep voice cut through the sound of falling rain, "I can see your bag there. Don't reckon it crawled under my porch by itself." Delilah remained silent, mortification burning her cheeks despite the chill that had settled into her bones. The boots disappeared from view, then suddenly a face appeared at the edge of the porch, a man's face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, water streaming from its edges. His eyes found hers immediately. "You planning on drowning under there, or would you prefer to come inside?" "I'm merely seeking shelter from the rain," Delilah managed, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "I'll be on my way once it subsides." The man studied her for a long moment. "Storm's set to last all night. I've got coffee brewing and stew on the stove." He extended a hand into her hiding place. "Name's Thomas Blackwood. This is my ranch you're sheltering under." Delilah stared at the outstretched hand. It was large, calloused, a working man's hand. Nothing like the soft, manicured hands of Boston's elite bachelors her mother had paraded before her. "I'm Delilah Ward," she said finally, not taking his hand. "I was traveling to Promise Creek. I'm to be the new schoolteacher." Thomas Blackwood's expression shifted slightly. "Promise Creek's a good 15 miles west of here. You'd have been walking till next Tuesday." He kept his hand extended, patience evident in his steady gaze. "Miss Ward, I promise you'll be safer inside than under my porch." Another crash of thunder made the decision for her. Delilah reluctantly reached for his hand, surprised at the gentleness with which he helped her from beneath the porch. Standing, she attempted to brush the mud from her once fine traveling dress, painfully aware of how bedraggled she must appear. Thomas Blackwood was taller than she'd realized, broad-shouldered and solid as an oak. His face was sun-weathered but younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with keen eyes that seemed to take her measure in an instant. "You're soaked through," he observed, retrieving her carpetbag. "Come inside before you catch your death." The interior of the ranch house was unexpectedly tidy, with simple but sturdy furniture. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the promised aroma of coffee and stew filled the air, making Delilah's stomach growl embarrassingly. She hadn't eaten since morning. "Bathroom's through there," Thomas said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "I'll find you something dry to wear, then we'll get some food in you." "Mr. Blackwood, I couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "My mother raised me better than to let a lady stand around in wet clothes catching pneumonia." Delilah wanted to protest further, but the mention of pneumonia silenced her. The disease had taken her father after a similar drenching in a Boston winter storm. She nodded stiffly and accepted the bundle of clothing he retrieved from a chest in the corner. In the small bathroom, Delilah peeled off her sodden garments with trembling fingers. The clothing Thomas had provided was clearly his own, a soft flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that she had to roll up several times at the ankles. The impropriety of wearing a man's clothing made her flush, but practicality won out over propriety. She used a towel to dry her long auburn hair as best she could, twisting it into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. When she emerged, Thomas was ladling stew into bowls at a table set for two. He glanced up, and something flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away. "Sit, eat," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Coffee's hot." The stew was rich and hearty, filled with tender beef and vegetables from what must be his own garden. Delilah hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. "How'd you end up under my porch, Miss Ward?" Thomas finally asked, refilling her coffee cup without asking. Delilah explained about the broken stagecoach, the driver's poor directions, and her determination to reach Promise Creek. "You're fortunate you found my place," Thomas said when she finished. "Not much between here and town except open country, dangerous country when a storm hits." "I'm grateful for your hospitality," Delilah said formally, though the words felt inadequate. "I'll compensate you, of course." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "For what? Stew and coffee, for the inconvenience," she clarified, lifting her chin slightly. "I was raised to pay my debts, Mr. Blackwood." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Out here, Miss Ward, we help each other because it's right, not because we expect payment." He stood and collected their empty bowls. "You'll take my bed tonight, I'll bunk out here." "I couldn't possibly displace you from your bed," Delilah protested. "You're not displacing me, I'm offering." Thomas set the dishes in a wash basin. "Unless you'd prefer to go back under the porch." Despite herself, Delilah smiled. "You make a compelling argument, Mr. Blackwood." Later, lying in Thomas's bed, surrounded by the unfamiliar scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to his sheets, Delilah listened to the storm rage outside. She should have been frightened, or at least uncomfortable in a stranger's home, but something about Thomas Blackwood's quiet strength was reassuring rather than threatening. It had been a long time since she'd felt safe. Morning arrived with startling brightness, the storm having spent itself overnight. Delilah woke to the aroma of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dry after hanging before the fire all night, and smoothed her hair as best she could without her brush, which remained in her carpetbag. Thomas was at the stove when she emerged, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He wore a fresh shirt, his hair still damp from washing. "Morning," he said without turning. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." Delilah hesitated in the doorway, suddenly awkward in the daylight. "I should be on my way to Promise Creek as soon as possible." Now Thomas did turn, spatula in hand. 15 miles is a fair walk. I've got to ride into town today anyway. I'll take you." Relief washed over her, though she tried not to show it. "That's very kind." Thomas slid bacon onto 2 plates alongside fried eggs and thick slices of bread. "Eat first, then we'll head out." Breakfast was another quiet affair, though less strained than the previous night's meal. Delilah found herself studying Thomas when he wasn't looking the way his hands dwarfed his coffee cup. The slight scar that ran along his jawline, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he almost smiled. After breakfast, Thomas saddled 2 horses, a sturdy black gelding for himself and a gentle-looking chestnut mare for Delilah. "Can you ride?" he asked, adjusting the stirrups on the mare. "Yes," Delilah said, approaching the horse with confidence. "My father kept horses in Boston." Thomas nodded approvingly as she mounted without assistance, gathering the reins expertly. He swung into his own saddle with practiced ease, and they set off down a well-worn trail that led westward from the ranch. The Montana landscape stretched out before them, vast and beautiful in the aftermath of the storm. Wildflowers had sprung up overnight, dotting the prairie with splashes of color. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still shrouded in clouds. "It's beautiful," Delilah said, breaking the companionable silence that had fallen between them. Thomas looked over at her, that almost smile playing at his lips. "Different from Boston, I expect." "Very different," she agreed, "but beautiful in its own way." "What brings a Boston lady to Promise Creek?" Thomas asked after another stretch of silence. Teaching can't be your only ambition. Delilah considered how much to reveal. My father died, there were debts, our home was sold to satisfy the creditors. She kept her tone matter of fact, though the wound was still fresh. I needed employment, and Promise Creek needed a teacher. It seemed providential. Thomas nodded, asking no further questions, for which Delilah was grateful. They rode in silence for a while longer before he spoke again. Promise Creek's a good town. Small but decent folks mostly. Mayor's wife, Mrs. Hollister, runs the boarding house where you'll likely stay. Fair warning, she considers herself the town's moral guardian. I'm quite accustomed to moral guardians, Delilah said dryly, thinking of her mother's society friends. I'm sure we'll get along famously. Thomas's laugh surprised her, deep and genuine. I'd pay good money to see that meeting. As they crested a hill, the town of Promise Creek came into view in the valley below. It was indeed small, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a white church steeple rising above the rest. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance, Delilah could see people moving about their business. Your new home, Thomas said, gesturing toward the town. Delilah felt a flutter of anxiety. What if the position had been filled in her absence? What if the townspeople found her unsuitable? What if they'll be lucky to have you, Thomas said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Delilah glanced at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. You hardly know me, Mr. Blackwood. I know enough. His eyes held hers for a moment before he nudged his horse forward. Let's get you settled. Promise Creek proved to be exactly as Thomas had described, small but bustling with activity. Their arrival drew curious glances, particularly when Thomas helped Delilah dismount in front of the mayor's office, his hands spanning her waist with surprising gentleness. Mayor Hollister was a portly man with a booming voice who expressed immense relief at Delilah's arrival. We feared you might have been caught in the storm, Miss Ward. When you didn't arrive yesterday, my wife was beside herself with worry. I was fortunate to find shelter, Delilah said, glancing at Thomas, who stood slightly behind her, hat in hand. The mayor's eyebrows rose. At Blackwood Ranch, well now, that is fortunate indeed. Something in his tone made Delilah blush, though she couldn't have said why. Mrs. Hollister appeared moments later, a thin, sharp-featured woman whose eyes missed nothing, especially not Delilah's crumpled traveling dress and Thomas Blackwood's presence at her side. You poor dear, she said, though her eyes remained calculating. You must be exhausted from your ordeal. We have your room all prepared at the boarding house. Thank you, Mrs. Hollister. That's very kind. Thomas cleared his throat. I should see to my business in town. He nodded to the mayor and his wife before turning to Delilah. Miss Ward, it was a pleasure making your acquaintance. Something like disappointment settled in Delilah's chest. Thank you for everything, Mr. Blackwood. He placed his hat on his head, tipping it slightly. If you need anything, my ranch is due east. Just follow the creek upstream. With that, he turned and walked away, his tall figure soon disappearing among the townspeople. Mrs. Hollister watched him go with narrowed eyes before turning back to Delilah. Come along, dear. We have much to discuss about your position. The schoolhouse needs a thorough cleaning before the children return on Monday. As Delilah followed the Hollisters toward the boarding house, she found herself glancing back toward the place where Thomas had disappeared, wondering if their paths would cross again. The first weeks in Promise Creek passed in a blur of activity. The schoolhouse, a simple one-room building at the edge of town, had indeed needed cleaning and repairs and new books, and a dozen other improvements that Delilah tackled with determination. Her 12 students ranged from 6 to 16 years of age, with varying levels of education and enthusiasm for learning. Mrs. Hollister proved to be exactly the moral guardian Thomas had described, monitoring Delilah's comings and goings, inspecting her lesson plans for any hint of progressive thinking, and regularly reminding her that a schoolteacher must be above reproach in all things. A young, unmarried woman must be particularly vigilant about her reputation, Mrs. Hollister said one evening as they sat in the boarding house parlor, especially one who spent an unchaperoned night in a bachelor's home. Delilah's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Mr. Blackwood was a perfect gentleman, Mrs. Hollister. He likely saved my life by offering shelter during the storm. "Oh, I'm sure he was," Mrs. Hollister said with a thin smile. "Thomas Blackwood has always been selective about his companionship. Not that any respectable woman would consider him suitable husband material, of course." Delilah's curiosity was piqued despite herself. "Why is that?" "His mother was Cheyenne," Mrs. Hollister said, lowering her voice though they were alone in the parlor. "His father brought her back after fighting Indians further east, caused quite the scandal, though that was before my time. Thomas was born legitimate, at least, though there's still talk about his heritage," she sniffed disapprovingly. "He keeps to himself mostly, which is for the best." Delilah thought of Thomas's sun-darkened skin, the straight black hair beneath his hat, the high cheekbones that she had admired without fully understanding why they seemed distinctive. Something protective rose in her chest. "I found Mr. Blackwood to be perfectly civilized and kind," she said firmly. "His heritage seems irrelevant to his character." Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Well, I suppose Boston society takes a different view on such matters. Here in Promise Creek we're more traditional." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Delilah found her thoughts returning to Thomas Blackwood. She hadn't seen him since her arrival in town, though she'd heard his name mentioned occasionally, mostly in hushed tones that ceased when she approached. It was nearly a month after her arrival when Thomas appeared at the schoolhouse door late one Friday afternoon. Delilah was alone, writing the next week's lessons on the blackboard when a knock startled her. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the school setting. "Miss Ward," he nodded formally. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, I was just finishing for the day." Delilah set down the chalk and brushed dust from her hands. "What brings you to town?" "Supply run." He glanced around the schoolhouse, noting the improvements she'd made. "Place looks good, better than when old Mr. Finch was teaching. Thank you, the children have been helping." Delilah moved closer, suddenly aware of how proper she must look in her high-necked shirtwaist and long skirt, a far cry from the bedraggled woman he'd found under his porch or the one who'd borrowed his clothes. "How have you been, Mr. Blackwood?" "Thomas," he corrected, meeting her eyes. "Been well enough. Ranch keeps me busy." He shifted his weight, seemed to gather his thoughts. "Town's having a harvest dance tomorrow night. Thought you might like to attend." Delilah blinked in surprise. "Are you asking to escort me, Mr. Blackwood?" A flash of uncertainty crossed his face. "Unless you've already made other arrangements." Delilah knew she should refuse. Mrs. Hollister would have palpitations at the very idea. The new schoolteacher attending the harvest dance with Thomas Blackwood would set tongues wagging for months. Her reputation, her position in the community, both could be compromised. "I'd be delighted," she heard herself say. The smile that transformed Thomas's face was worth whatever gossip might follow. "I'll collect you at 7 then." From the boarding house, Delilah nodded, already imagining Mrs. Hollister's reaction. "I'll be ready." After Thomas left, Delilah leaned against her desk, heart beating faster than it should. What had possessed her to accept? She barely knew the man. Yet something about Thomas Blackwood drew her, his quiet strength, his self-contained dignity, the kindness he'd shown a stranger huddled beneath his porch. Mrs. Hollister's reaction that evening was everything Delilah had anticipated and worse. "Thomas Blackwood asked you to the harvest dance." She pressed a hand to her chest as if experiencing heart palpitations. "And you accepted? My dear Miss Ward, have you taken leave of your senses? I don't see the harm in attending a community event with a neighbor who once showed me kindness," Delilah said, calmly continuing her mending. "No harm, no harm." Mrs. Hollister's voice rose to a near screech. "The harm, Miss Ward, is to your reputation. A schoolteacher must be above reproach. The school board will not look kindly on you socializing with a man who is half Cheyenne." Delilah supplied, setting down her sewing to look Mrs. Hollister directly in the eye. "I was raised to judge people by their character, Mrs. Hollister, not by their parentage. This isn't Boston, Miss Ward. Out here, such things matter. Perhaps they shouldn't." Delilah gathered her sewing. "If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for tomorrow evening." In the privacy of her small room, Delilah examined her limited wardrobe. She had brought only 2 good dresses from Boston, one black for mourning, which wouldn't do for a dance, and one deep blue that had been her best reception dress. She removed the blue dress from her trunk, shaking out the wrinkles. It was a bit formal for a country dance, but it would have to do. The next evening, Delilah dressed with particular care, arranging her auburn hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical knot. The blue dress, while perhaps too fine for Promise Creek, fit her perfectly, accentuating her small waist and bringing out the color of her eyes. Mrs. Hollister hovered in the hallway as Delilah descended the stairs. "You're determined to go through with this foolishness." "I am," Delilah confirmed, adjusting her shawl. "Please don't wait up, Mrs. Hollister. I'm quite capable of seeing myself in." A knock at the door prevented further argument. Mrs. Hollister opened it with obvious reluctance to reveal Thomas standing on the porch, looking startlingly different from their previous encounters. He wore a clean black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. His dark hair was neatly combed and he'd clearly shaved for the occasion. "Mrs. Hollister," he nodded politely before his eyes found Delilah on the stairs. Something flickered in his gaze, admiration, perhaps, or surprise before he collected himself. "Miss Ward, you look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, you're quite handsome yourself." A slight flush colored Thomas's cheekbones as he offered his arm. "Shall we?" The harvest dance was being held in the town hall, a large building at the center of Promise Creek that served multiple community functions. As they approached, Delilah could hear music and laughter spilling out into the evening air. "Having second thoughts?" Thomas asked quietly as they paused outside the entrance. "Not too late to change your mind." Delilah tightened her grip on his arm. "Not at all, are you?" Thomas's smile was answer enough as he led her inside. The hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty pumpkins, corn shocks, and wheat sheaves arranged artfully around the perimeter. A small band played at one end, and couples already swirled around the dance floor. Nearly everyone in Promise Creek seemed to be in attendance, and a noticeable hush fell over the gathering as Thomas and Delilah entered. "Ignore them," Thomas murmured, leading her further into the room. Mayor Hollister approached, looking somewhat uncomfortable but determined to be hospitable. "Miss Ward, Blackwood, glad you could join us." He glanced between them. "Didn't realize you two were acquainted." "Mr. Blackwood was kind enough to invite me," Delilah said smoothly. "I'm looking forward to meeting more of the community." "Yes, well," the mayor cleared his throat. "Refreshments are over there, dance floors open to all." With a final curious glance, he moved away to greet other arrivals. "Would you care to dance?" Thomas asked, offering his hand. Delilah nodded, allowing him to lead her onto the floor just as the band began a waltz. Thomas's hand settled at her waist, warm and steady, as he guided her into the dance with unexpected grace. "You dance well," Delilah observed, surprised. "My mother insisted I learn." A shadow crossed his face. She believed a man should know how to behave in any company. They moved together easily, as if they'd danced 100 times before. Delilah was acutely aware of the eyes following them, of the whispers behind hands, but found she cared less than she might have expected. "They're talking about us," she said quietly. "They always talk about me," Thomas replied, his voice matter of fact rather than bitter. "Now they're just including you in the conversation. Mrs. Hollister mentioned your mother was Cheyenne." Thomas's steps faltered slightly before he recovered. "Does that trouble you?" "No," Delilah said honestly. "I'm only sorry if it's caused you difficulty." His expression softened. "My father loved my mother until the day she died. He never regretted bringing her home despite what some thought of their marriage. They sound like remarkable people." They were. Thomas guided her through a turn. "My father was a lot like you, actually. Came west from Philadelphia with certain ideas about how things should be. Met my mother when he was scouting for the army. Caused quite the scandal when he brought her back as his wife. And now you live alone on their ranch." "It's my home," Thomas said simply. "Always has been." As the evening progressed, the initial stiffness of the other attendees gradually thawed. Several of Delilah's students approached to introduce their parents, all of whom were polite if reserved. Thomas was clearly known to everyone, though few seemed to interact with him regularly. "Don't you get lonely out at your ranch?" Delilah asked as they enjoyed cups of cider during a break in the dancing. Thomas considered the question. Sometimes, but I've got my horses, my cattle. Plenty of work to keep me occupied. He glanced at her. What about you? Boston society must be livelier than Promise Creek. Boston society is primarily concerned with who is marrying whom and for how much money, Delilah said dryly. I find I prefer teaching children who actually want to learn. And do they want to learn? Some do, Delilah smiled, thinking of her students. Young Billy Thompson has a remarkable mind for mathematics, and Sarah Jenkins devours books faster than I can provide them. You care about them, Thomas observed. It shows when you speak of them. I do. Delilah met his eyes. Teaching was my mother's idea, a suitable occupation for a spinster with no prospects, but I've discovered I genuinely enjoy it. Spinster? Thomas's eyebrows rose. Surely Boston's young men weren't all blind. Delilah laughed, a genuine sound that drew glances from nearby couples. I had suitors, none that I found particularly compelling, and after my father's death, none that found our family's reduced circumstances compelling. Their loss, Thomas said quietly. The moment stretched between them, filled with something Delilah couldn't quite name but found she didn't want to break. Finally, Thomas set down his empty cup. One more dance before I take you home. This time the band played a livelier tune, and Thomas led her through steps she didn't know but quickly learned, laughing as they moved together in perfect synchrony. By the end, Delilah was flushed and breathless, her carefully arranged hair coming loose in tendrils around her face. I should take you back, Thomas said reluctantly as the music ended, before Mrs. Hollister sends out a search party. The walk back to the boarding house was quiet, the night air cool against Delilah's heated skin. Thomas offered his jacket, which she accepted gratefully, surrounded by his scent and warmth. I enjoyed this evening, she said as they reached the boarding house porch. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for accepting. Thomas took his jacket as she returned it, their fingers brushing briefly, despite the potential damage to your reputation. My reputation can withstand an evening of dancing, Mr. Blackwood. Thomas, he corrected again, his voice low, will you come riding with me tomorrow? I could show you some of the country around Promise Creek. Delilah knew she should refuse. One dance was a social obligation, a private riding excursion was something else entirely. But the thought of returning to the boarding house, to Mrs. Hollister's disapproving stares and the confines of her respectable position suddenly seemed unbearable. I'd like that, she said. After church, Thomas nodded. I'll bring a horse for you around noon. They stood for a moment longer, neither quite ready to part. Finally, Thomas took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture far more courtly than she would have expected. Good night, Delilah, he said, using her given name for the first time. Good night, Thomas. She watched him walk away before entering the boarding house where Mrs. Hollister predictably awaited her return, ready with a lecture on propriety and reputation that Delilah barely heard. Her thoughts were already on tomorrow's ride, on the prospect of freedom beyond Promise Creek's watchful eyes. Thomas arrived precisely at noon the following day, leading the same chestnut mare Delilah had ridden into town that first day. He'd brought a proper side saddle this time, though Delilah almost wished for the freedom of riding astride as she had before. Mrs. Hollister watched from the window as Thomas helped Delilah mount, her disapproval evident even through the glass. Delilah pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the man beside her and the beautiful day stretching before them. Where are we going? She asked as they rode away from town, following a different trail than the one that led to Thomas's ranch. There's a place I want to show you, he said, glancing at her with that almost smile. If you're up for a bit of a ride. Lead on, Delilah replied, returning his smile with one of her own. They rode for nearly an hour, the terrain gradually changing from open prairie to more wooded country as they approached the foothills. Thomas pointed out landmarks along the way, a distinctive rock formation, a stand of aspens that would soon turn golden, a creek that fed into the larger river that gave Promise Creek its name. Finally, they crested a hill and Thomas reined in his horse. Here we are. Delilah gasped at the view spread before them. A small valley lay below, sheltered by surrounding hills with a crystal-clear lake at its center. Wildflowers carpeted the meadow in splashes of purple, yellow, and blue, and a family of deer grazed peacefully at the water's edge. "It's beautiful," she breathed, drinking in the scene. "My mother called it the Hidden Valley," Thomas said, his voice soft with memory. "She used to bring me here when I was a boy, said it was a place of power where the spirits of earth and water met. I can see why she thought so." Delilah glanced at him, touched that he would share such a personal place with her. "Thank you for bringing me here." Thomas dismounted and helped Delilah from her side saddle. They secured the horses to graze, then walked toward the lake, moving slowly through knee-high grass dotted with late-season wildflowers. "Did you come to church this morning?" Delilah asked, realizing she hadn't seen him in the congregation. Thomas shook his head. "I don't attend much. The Reverend and I have different views on certain matters, such as whether people like me belong in his congregation," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "He's made it clear over the years that my presence makes others uncomfortable." Anger flashed through Delilah. "That's absurd. Christianity teaches that all are welcome. Theory and practice often differ, Miss Ward." Thomas's use of her formal name created a sudden distance between them. "I've learned to find my peace elsewhere." They reached the lakeshore, where Thomas spread a blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag. From the same bag came a simple picnic bread, cheese, dried beef, and apples which he arranged between them. "A peace offering," he said, his easy manner returning, "for bringing up unpleasant topics on such a beautiful day." Delilah accepted a slice of apple. "I don't find honesty unpleasant, Thomas. I'd rather know the truth of things. Even when the truth is uncomfortable, especially then." She met his gaze steadily. "I want to know you, not just the parts you think will be acceptable to a Boston schoolteacher." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, surprise, perhaps, or a new wariness. "Be careful what you wish for, Delilah. My life hasn't always been respectable. Tell me anyway." And so he did. As they shared the simple meal, Thomas told her about growing up as the son of a white rancher and a Cheyenne woman in a territory still raw from conflict. How his mother had taught him her language and traditions alongside his father's. How he'd learned to navigate both worlds while being fully accepted by neither. "After my parents died, influenza took them both in '79. I left for a while. Rode with a cattle outfit up to Montana, worked some silver mines in Colorado, even tried my hand at bounty hunting for a spell." "Bounty hunting?" Delilah couldn't hide her surprise. Thomas's mouth twisted. "Not my proudest time. I was angry after my parents died, felt I had something to prove." He tossed a pebble into the lake, watching the ripples spread. "Came back 5 years ago. The ranch was run down but still mine. Decided it was time to make my peace with this place." "And have you made your peace?" Thomas considered the question, his gaze moving from the lake to Delilah's face. "I'm working on it." They spent hours at the lake, talking as they never had before. Delilah found herself sharing stories of her sheltered upbringing in Boston society, her father's business failures that had left them nearly destitute, her mother's desperate attempts to secure a wealthy husband for her only daughter before consumption claimed her life 3 years earlier. "My father held on longer," she said, picking at a blade of grass. "He tried to rebuild the business, but his health was never good after Mother died. When pneumonia took him last winter, the creditors descended like vultures. So you came west." "So I came west," Delilah agreed. "New life, new beginning. Any regrets?" Thomas asked, watching her closely. Delilah looked out over the peaceful lake, considering the question honestly. "I miss certain comforts, books, music, conversation about something other than crops and weather." She smiled ruefully. "But no, I don't regret coming here. Promise Creek needs a teacher, and I needed Promise Creek." The sun was beginning to lower in the sky when they finally packed up their picnic and prepared to leave. As Thomas helped Delilah back into her saddle, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," he said, looking up at her, "for listening, for sharing." "Thank you for bringing me here," Delilah replied softly. "Will you show me more of your world, Thomas?" His smile was answer enough as he mounted his own horse and led the way back toward Promise Creek. The following weeks brought a shift in their relationship. Thomas began appearing in town more frequently, often timing his visits to coincide with the end of the school day. They would walk together through Promise Creek, sometimes stopping at the general store or the small lending library that operated out of the back of the church. The townspeople's reactions were mixed. Some, like Mayor Hollister, maintained a polite distance while clearly disapproving. Others, particularly the parents of Delilah's students, gradually warmed to the sight of their teacher in the company of Thomas Blackwood. A few, like old Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store, actively approved. "About time that young man found someone worth courting," she told Delilah one afternoon as Thomas examined farming tools on the other side of the store. "Been alone too long, that one has." "We're merely friends, Mrs. Peterson," Delilah protested, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. The older woman snorted. "Honey, I've been watching folks fall in love for 50 years. I know what I'm seeing." Was it love? Delilah found herself wondering as October gave way to November and the first snows dusted the mountains surrounding Promise Creek. Certainly, she enjoyed Thomas's company more than anyone else's. She looked forward to their conversations, to the quiet understanding that had developed between them. She admired his strength, his integrity, his refusal to be defined by others' expectations. But love. That seemed a dangerous word for what was growing between them. Mrs. Hollister certainly thought so. Her disapproval had hardened into active interference, scheduling Delilah for additional duties at church socials, arranging chance meetings with the young banker who had recently arrived from Denver, and repeatedly reminding her of the school board's expectations regarding a teacher's moral character. "People are talking, Miss Ward," she said one evening, cornering Delilah in the boarding house kitchen. "Your association with Thomas Blackwood is becoming inappropriate." "My association with Mr. Blackwood is perfectly proper," Delilah countered, continuing to wash her dinner dishes. "We have never been unchaperoned in a compromising situation." "That's not the point," Mrs. Hollister's voice rose. "A respectable woman doesn't keep company with a man like that, regardless of how proper their behavior might be. What will your students think? What example are you setting?" Delilah set down the plate she was drying, turning to face the older woman. "What example? That people should be judged by their character rather than their heritage, that kindness and integrity matter more than social standing. Those seem like valuable lessons to me, Mrs. Hollister." "You're being deliberately obtuse," Mrs. Hollister snapped. "This isn't about his background. It's about your position in this community. The school board has already expressed concern." Something cold settled in Delilah's stomach. "Are you saying my position is in jeopardy, Mrs.?" Hollister's expression held a hint of satisfaction. "I'm saying choices have consequences, Miss Ward, even in Promise Creek." The threat lingered in Delilah's mind as November deepened, bringing shorter days and colder nights. Thomas had invited her to his ranch for Thanksgiving dinner, a private celebration, just the two of them. She knew accepting would be seen as a declaration of sorts, not just to Thomas, but to the entire community. The day before Thanksgiving, snow began falling in earnest, large, lazy flakes that quickly blanketed Promise Creek in white silence. School had been dismissed early in anticipation of the storm, and Delilah stood at her bedroom window watching the transformation of the familiar landscape into something magical and new. A knock at the boarding house door drew her attention. Moments later, Mrs. Hollister appeared in her doorway, expression pinched. "Mr. Blackwood is downstairs," she said stiffly. "I've told him it's highly inappropriate to call during a snowstorm, but he insists on speaking with you." Delilah hurried downstairs to find Thomas in the front hallway, snow melting from his hat and coat. His expression was troubled. "Is something wrong?" she asked, aware of Mrs. Hollister hovering nearby. "Storm's getting worse," Thomas said without preamble. "Road to my place will be impassable by morning. If you still want to come for Thanksgiving, you'd need to leave now." Delilah hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Hollister's disapproving face, then back to Thomas. Something in his expression told her this was more than an invitation to dinner, it was a turning point. Stay in Promise Creek, maintain her respectable position as the town's schoolteacher, or follow her heart into the unknown. "I'll get my coat," she said quietly. Mrs. Hollister gasped. Miss Ward, you cannot be serious. To leave during a snowstorm to spend the night at a bachelor's home, it's beyond inappropriate. The school board will hear of this. Then they'll hear of it, Delilah said, suddenly calm. I'm a grown woman, Mrs. Hollister, not one of your charges to be supervised and controlled. I'm going to spend Thanksgiving with Thomas. She retrieved her coat and a small overnight bag, packing quickly while Mrs. Hollister continued to protest. When she returned downstairs, Thomas was waiting silently, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes held a question. I'm ready, Delilah said, answering both the spoken and unspoken queries. Thomas had brought a small sleigh rather than horses, pulled by a sturdy draft horse well accustomed to snow. He tucked heavy furs around Delilah before taking up the reins, and they set off through the increasingly heavy snowfall. Are you sure about this? Thomas asked once they were beyond the town limits. Mrs. Hollister wasn't making idle threats. I know, Delilah said, watching the snow swirl around them, but I'm tired of living my life according to others' expectations. First my mother's, then Boston society's, now Promise Creek's. And what do you want, Delilah Ward? Thomas's voice was almost lost in the hushed world of falling snow. Delilah turned to look at him, snow catching in his dark hair and on his eyelashes. I want to be free to make my own choices, to follow my own heart. And where is your heart leading you? Instead of answering, Delilah reached for his gloved hand, twining her fingers with his. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in companionable silence, the only sounds the soft shush of the sleigh runners on snow and the rhythmic breathing of the horse. Thomas's ranch looked different in the snow, the simple cabin transformed into something from a fairy tale, windows glowing with warm light. He had clearly prepared for her arrival, despite the uncertainty of the weather. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth within. Once inside, Delilah was surprised by the changes since her first visit. The main room had been thoroughly cleaned, with new curtains at the windows and a colorful woven blanket draped over the back of the sofa. A small pine tree stood in one corner, undecorated but filling the air with its fresh scent. It's not much, Thomas said, watching her reaction, but I wanted it to be welcoming. It's lovely, Delilah said honestly, removing her snow-dusted coat. Thomas built up the fire while Delilah explored the cabin. It was small but well-designed, with the main room serving as both kitchen and living area, a door leading to the bedroom she had used during her first stay, and another to what she presumed was Thomas's room. Are you hungry? Thomas asked, hanging up his coat. I've got stew simmering. They ate at the small table by the window, watching the snow continue to fall outside. The stew was rich and hearty, accompanied by fresh bread that Thomas admitted he'd bought from the bakery in town. I can wrangle cattle and track outlaws, but baking bread defeats me, he said with a self-deprecating smile. After dinner, they settled by the fire, Thomas in the armchair and Delilah on the sofa. For the first time since they'd begun spending time together, an awkward silence fell between them. I've made things difficult for you in town, Thomas finally said, staring into the flames. I never meant to jeopardize your position. You haven't done anything, Delilah objected. I'm the one who's chosen to spend time with you, to accept your invitations. The consequences are mine to bear. Still, Thomas looked troubled. Teaching means a lot to you. I don't want to be the reason you lose that. There are other schools, Delilah said quietly, other towns. Thomas's head came up sharply. You'd leave Promise Creek if necessary. She met his gaze steadily. What about you? Would you leave your ranch, your home? He considered the question, fingers tapping thoughtfully on the arm of his chair. I've left before. Could do it again, I suppose, if there was reason enough. The conversation drifted to other topics as the evening progressed. Books they had both read, places Thomas had seen in his travels, Delilah's dreams of perhaps someday opening a proper school with multiple classrooms and specialized teaching. You could do it here, Thomas suggested. Promise Creek is growing. In a few years, they'll need more than a one-room schoolhouse. If they don't run me out of town first, Delilah said wryly, they wouldn't dare. Thomas's voice held a protective edge that warmed her more than the fire. When the mantel clock struck 10, Thomas stood. You should get some rest. I've prepared the bedroom for you, fresh sheets and everything. Where will you sleep? Delilah asked, suddenly very aware of the intimacy of their situation. Out here, Thomas said, gesturing to the sofa. I've slept in far worse places. Delilah nodded, gathering her overnight bag. At the bedroom door, she paused and turned back. Thomas, thank you for everything, he smiled, the firelight casting his features in warm gold and shadow. Sleep well, Delilah. In the bedroom, Delilah changed into her nightgown and robe, then sat at the small dressing table to brush out her hair. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with something more than just the reflection of the lamp. She looked alive. More alive than she had in years. A soft knock at the door startled her. Delilah, I brought some extra blankets, the temperature's dropping. She opened the door to find Thomas with an armful of quilts, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her in her robe, hair loose around her shoulders. Thank you, she said, accepting the blankets. Their fingers brushed during the exchange and neither pulled away. For a long moment they stood frozen in the doorway, the blankets between them, eyes locked in silent communication. Delilah, Thomas said, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. I should go. Should you? The words surprised her as much as him. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. You know what people will say if you stay here, what they'll think. I don't care what they think, Delilah said with sudden clarity. I care what you think, what you feel. What I feel. Thomas gave a short, disbelieving laugh. I've been falling in love with you since I found you hiding under my porch in the rain. But loving me comes with a price I'm not sure you're prepared to pay. Shouldn't that be my decision? Delilah stepped closer, the blankets still clutched between them. I'm not a child, Thomas. I know my own mind, my own heart. And what does your heart tell you? His voice was barely audible. Delilah took the final step that separated them, letting the blankets fall forgotten to the floor. That some things are worth any price. The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, tentative, questioning. Thomas's hands hovered at her waist, not quite touching, giving her every opportunity to step away. Instead, Delilah moved closer, her hands finding his shoulders, her body fitting against his as if they'd been designed as two halves of a whole. The gentleness didn't last. Months of restraint, of careful propriety, melted away as Thomas gathered her closer, one hand tangling in her loose hair, the other pressing against the small of her back. Delilah responded with equal fervor, pouring all her unspoken feelings into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. We should stop, he said, though his hands still held her close. If we don't stop now— I don't want to stop, Delilah whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. I want you, Thomas. All of you? He pulled back slightly to search her face. Are you certain once this line is crossed? I've never been more certain of anything. Delilah reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. I love you, Thomas Blackwood. Whatever comes after this night, I want to face it knowing we didn't let fear keep us apart. Thomas's answer was another kiss, deeper than the first, as he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Delilah woke slowly, aware of unfamiliar warmth beside her and strong arms holding her close. Thomas was still asleep, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen before, dark hair falling across his forehead. The events of the night rushed back, bringing a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with remembered pleasure. They had crossed a line, irrevocably altering their relationship and her standing in Promise Creek. Strangely, Delilah found she had no regrets. Thomas stirred, his eyes opening to find her watching him. A slow smile spread across his face. Morning. Good morning, Delilah replied, suddenly shy despite their intimacy. He reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. Any regrets in the cold light of day? None, she said honestly. Only that we didn't do this sooner. Thomas's smile faded slightly. Though I expect there will be consequences. Delilah sighed, the real world intruding on their private happiness. Mrs. Hollister will have informed the entire town by now. The school board will likely meet today to discuss my moral failings. I'm sorry, Thomas said, pulling her closer. I never meant to cost you your position. I'm not, Delilah said firmly. Some things matter more than a job. More than reputation. They rose eventually, preparing a simple breakfast together in the kitchen. The domesticity of it, Thomas cooking eggs while Delilah made coffee, moving around each other with easy familiarity, felt both strange and completely natural. After breakfast, Thomas brought out a small box he'd hidden away. "I got you something. For Christmas originally, but, well, seems appropriate to give it to you now." Inside was a delicate silver pendant, a small wildflower preserved somehow in clear resin, hanging from a fine chain. "It's from the Hidden Valley," Thomas explained as he fastened it around her neck. "I collected some of the flowers during our picnic, had a jeweler in Helena make it when I was there last month." "It's beautiful," Delilah said, touching the pendant where it rested just below her collarbone. "I'll treasure it." They spent the day in quiet contentment, preparing Thanksgiving dinner together, talking about everything and nothing. Neither mentioned the future directly, though it hung between them questions of where they would go from here, what choices lay ahead. As evening approached, Thomas grew more pensive. "We should talk about what happens next," he finally said as they sat before the fire, "when we return to town. I suspect I'll no longer be welcome at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house," Delilah said wryly. "And the school board will likely dismiss me. You could stay here," Thomas said quietly. "With me?" Delilah looked at him in surprise. "Are you asking me to live with you without marriage?" "No." Thomas set aside his coffee cup and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I'm asking you to marry me, Delilah Ward, to be my wife, to share my life, whatever that might bring." Joy bubbled up within her, unexpected and overwhelming. "Are you certain? You'd be tying yourself to a disgraced schoolteacher with no prospects and no dowry." "I'm tying myself to the woman I love," Thomas corrected. "The rest is just details." "Then yes," Delilah said, tears of happiness threatening. "Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Blackwood." His smile was brilliant as he rose to kiss her, sealing their promise with more than words. They returned to Promise Creek the following day, the roads now passable though still snow-covered. As expected, their arrival caused something of a sensation. Thomas driving his sleigh boldly down the main street, Delilah seated beside him, her head held high despite the whispers and stares. Mrs. Hollister was waiting on the boarding house porch, her thin face set in lines of righteous indignation. "The school board met this morning, Miss Ward," she announced before Delilah could even descend from the sleigh. "Your services are no longer required." "I expected as much," Delilah said calmly. "I'll collect my things and be gone within the hour." "That won't be necessary," came another voice. Mayor Hollister appeared behind his wife, looking uncomfortable but determined. "The board's decision wasn't unanimous, Miss Ward. Some of us feel you've been an excellent teacher regardless of personal choices." Mrs. Hollister made a sound of outrage. "Horace, we agreed to review the situation after the holidays," the mayor corrected, giving his wife a quelling look. "In the meantime, Miss Ward is welcome to continue teaching until a permanent decision is reached." Delilah glanced at Thomas, who looked as surprised as she felt. "That's very kind, Mayor Hollister, but there's something you should know." She took Thomas's hand. "Mr. Blackwood has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted." The mayor's eyebrows rose. "I see, well, that changes things." "Does it?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a challenge. "Married teachers are permitted in Promise Creek, aren't they?" "Well, yes, of course, but then I don't see the problem," Thomas continued. "Unless there's some other objection to my future wife continuing in her position." The mayor shifted uncomfortably, caught between his wife's obvious fury and the logic of Thomas's argument. "No, I suppose not, assuming the marriage takes place soon." "As soon as possible," Delilah confirmed, squeezing Thomas's hand. "We were hoping Reverend Phillips might be available today, in fact." This was news to Thomas, who looked at her with surprise before a slow smile spread across his face. "Today works for me." And so it was that Delilah Ward became Delilah Blackwood on a snowy November afternoon, with Mayor Hollister and a hastily assembled group of witnesses in attendance. The Reverend, after some initial hesitation, performed the ceremony with reasonable grace, though Mrs. Hollister refused to attend. Several of Delilah's students and their parents came, having heard the news as it spread rapidly through town. Old Mrs. Peterson closed her store early to be there, bringing a small cake she'd baked that morning for Thanksgiving. "Knew you two were meant for each other," she told Delilah as they shared cake after the ceremony. "Some things are just written in the stars." They spent their wedding night at Thomas's their ranch, now making plans for the future between moments of newfound marital intimacy. "We'll need to expand the cabin if we're to have a family," Thomas said as they lay together in the darkness. "Add another bedroom at least." "A family," Delilah repeated, the word bringing a rush of warmth. "Do you want children with you?" "Yes," his hand rested protectively over her stomach. "A houseful, if you're willing." Delilah laughed softly. "Perhaps we should start with one and see how we manage." Winter deepened into 1892, bringing changes to Promise Creek and to the Blackwoods. Delilah continued teaching, her position secured by her marriage and by the steady improvement in her students' academic achievements. Some parents had withdrawn their children initially, but most returned when it became clear that Mrs. Blackwood was the same dedicated teacher she had always been. Thomas expanded his cattle operation, hiring 2 ranch hands to help with the increasing workload. He began attending church occasionally, sitting proudly beside his wife, despite the mixed reactions of the congregation. Gradually, the novelty of their marriage faded, and they became simply another couple in the growing community. By spring, Delilah had news of her own to share. She told Thomas on a sunny April afternoon as they picnicked once again in the hidden valley, now green with new growth. "A baby," Thomas repeated, his expression shifting from shock to wonder to joy in the space of heartbeats. "We're having a baby in October, the doctor thinks," Delilah confirmed, laughing as Thomas gathered her into a careful embrace. "Are you happy?" he asked, searching her face. "It's happening faster than we planned." "I'm very happy," Delilah assured him, placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "Our child will be loved and cherished, with a heritage to be proud of from both sides." Thomas's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "My mother would have loved you," he said softly, "almost as much as I do." Their daughter, Rose, was born on a crisp October day as the aspens turned golden on the hillsides. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes, and from her first breath was adored by both parents, Mrs. Hollister, who had maintained a frosty distance throughout Delilah's pregnancy, appeared at the ranch 3 days after Rose's birth, bearing a handmade baby blanket and an awkward olive branch. "Every child deserves a welcome," she said stiffly, presenting the blanket to a surprised Delilah. "Even if one doesn't entirely approve of the circumstances." It wasn't quite an apology, but Delilah accepted it as such. "Would you like to hold her?" she offered, extending the sleeping infant. Mrs. Hollister hesitated before carefully taking Rose in her arms. The baby opened her eyes, regarding the older woman solemnly for a moment before closing them again with a tiny sigh. "She's quite beautiful," Mrs. Hollister admitted, her expression softening, despite her unconventional parentage. "She's perfect," Thomas said from the doorway, where he'd been silently observing the exchange, "and she'll be raised to be proud of both sides of her heritage." Mrs. Hollister returned the baby to Delilah, her momentary softness fading. "Yes, well, I should be going. The mayor will be wondering where I've got to." After she left, Thomas sat beside Delilah on their bed, one finger gently stroking Rose's cheek. "Think she'll ever fully accept us?" "Probably not," Delilah said honestly, "but she doesn't need to. We have each other, we have Rose, and we have a community that's learning to accept us as we are." Thomas leaned over to kiss her, then pressed another gentle kiss to his daughter's forehead. "Who would have thought," he murmured, "that finding you hiding under my porch would lead to all this?" "I think it was always meant to be," Delilah said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they gazed down at their sleeping daughter. "Some things are just written in the stars." The years that followed brought more children, twin boys, Thomas Jr. and James, born 2 years after Rose, and another daughter, Elizabeth, 3 years after that. The cabin expanded accordingly, growing from the simple structure where Delilah had first sought shelter to a proper family home filled with laughter and love. Promise Creek grew as well, eventually requiring the larger school that Delilah had once dreamed of. She became its first headmistress, hiring additional teachers, and implementing a curriculum that combined traditional subjects with practical skills needed for life in the West. Thomas's ranch prospered, becoming one of the largest and most successful operations in the territory. He taught their children to ride almost before they could walk, sharing with them his knowledge of both his father's ranching traditions and his mother's Cheyenne heritage. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Delilah back to the Hidden Valley, now a special place for their entire family. As they sat by the lake, watching their children play among the wildflowers, Delilah fingered the silver pendant she still wore daily. Any regrets? Thomas asked, echoing the question he'd asked on their first morning together. Delilah looked at her husband, his face more lined now, with silver threading through his dark hair, but his eyes still holding the same warmth and integrity that had first drawn her to him. "Not one," she said, leaning against him as they watched their children's laughter dance across the valley. "Every step, every choice led us here. How could I regret any of it?" Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Who would have thought a rainstorm would bring me everything I never knew I wanted? Who indeed?" Delilah smiled, turning her face up for a proper kiss. "I'm just glad I chose your porch to hide under." "So am I," Thomas murmured against her lips. "So am I." In the years that followed, the story of how Delilah had hidden under Thomas Blackwood's porch during a rainstorm became family legend, told and retold to grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. A tale of two people from different worlds, brought together by chance, and bound by love that transcended society's expectations. And in Promise Creek, long after both Thomas and Delilah had passed on, leaving their ranch and legacy to their children, old-timers would still point to the schoolhouse and tell newcomers about the Boston schoolteacher and the half-Cheyenne rancher who had defied convention and, in doing so, helped change a community's heart. "Some love stories," they'd say, "are just written in the stars."